Okay, you've already tested the Revofit system on your patient's check socket. You've confirmed panel placement, pad thickness, dial location, and the functionality. Now it's time to get your patient into a great definitive socket, one that will keep them happy, healthy, and actively adjusting for the next 3 to 5 years. We will walk you through the Revofit lamination process step by step because we want you to master this process. We know that once you add adjustability to your practice, you will have a powerful new tool in your effort to make sockets that fit, not just today, but every day. Before you start, prep your lamination supplies and make sure you have all of the following items: sandpaper, superglue, 60-second composite adhesive, a razor blade, and your Revofit kit, which will include the dial base, dial, tubing, lace, and wire lace feeder. During fabrication, keep your check socket nearby. You will reference it along the way for panel placement and lacing pathways. But there are a couple of things to notice up front. First, look at the posterior panel. It's likely that the bar above the panel is narrow and will need to be reinforced on the first lamination. Also, remember that Revofit adjustability works best with a flexible insert, so lamination will be done with the flexible insert over the mold. With those things in mind, reinforce your posterior bar and laminate your first layer as you normally would. Then prep the socket for a second lamination by sanding it. Where do I place the panels? To draw your panels, reference your check socket for size and shape of the panels, measuring if necessary. You will also sketch the trim lines at this point, being aware of the size and strength capacity of the posterior bar. A round object is helpful here as you draw your panel lines to ensure your curves and turns are not too sharp. Where do I put the dial? For your first socket, the dial will go on the top quarter of the posterior panel because this gives the patient the greatest amount of adjustability. As you gain experience with the Revofit system, you will be able to place the dial almost anywhere on the socket. But for now, this is the best place to start. Because it's going on the posterior panel, you will not actually draw its location until you establish the lacing pathway across the panel. How do I make it connect? Before drawing our lacing pathway, let's quickly recap the basic rules for effective lacing. Establish pathways on the panels first using the quarter rule. The pathways must be parallel across the panels and perpendicular to the panel edges. Pathways should extend 1 centimeter past the panel edges before turning. All curves should be smooth and gradual, no sharp angles. So, start with the panels and apply the quarter rule. Use a ruler to mark the panels into 4 equal sections by finding the center of the panel, then dividing the top half and bottom half in half again. The pathway lines will be drawn parallel to each other across the top quarter and the bottom quarter of each panel. From there, extend the pathways 1 centimeter beyond the edge of the panels on both sides. Next, sketch the dial position in the center of the top line. The dial base insertion points will mark the beginning and ending points of the pathway. Now, connect the posterior panel to the adjacent panels, making a gentle curve on the frame, if necessary, to connect the panels in a way that maintains the parallel pathway across the panels. You will have 2 turnarounds on the frame, which will loop the pathway back across the panel and into the dial base. Attach the Revofit hardware. With the panels and the pathway clearly marked, mount the dial base by roughing up the bottom and securing it with 60-second adhesive. If you would like, you can cut the tabs on the bottom of the base, like we've done here. Now, lay down the tubing. This is basically the same process you followed on the check socket, but there are some key differences you may notice. First, cut one end of the tube and pack the end with clay before inserting it into the center of the silicone on the dial base. Then, secure the tubing with a dot of superglue every inch or so. To ensure there aren't any kinks in the tube, use a round object, such as a dowel, to guide the tubing around the turns. As you approach the reinsertion point, stop gluing about 10 centimeters from the base. Measure the length, cut the tube, pack with clay, and insert it fully into the silicone. Now secure that length with superglue. Remember, it's important to know that if you get a kink in the tube, you must remove the entire length of tubing from the socket and start over. You can trim the kink and reapply the same tubing, but the tubing on the socket must be one continuous length of kink-free tubing. You cannot splice together 2 pieces of tubing on the socket. Now, with the dial and the tubing in place, backfill any gaps under the tube or base with 60-second adhesive. Any unfilled gaps will kink the tubing under vacuum. Final lamination. Set up for final lamination, preparing more resin than you think you'll need. This will also probably take more time than you usually allot for. Be careful. As you work the resin up the mold, do not displace the tubing and the dial. Also, air and resin tend to collect around the tubing, so make sure you work out any excess before the resin sets. Recreate your trim lines, trim, and remove the socket from the mold. Remove your insert and redraw your panels. Reference your check socket again for this. Also, you can use the quarter rule to help you locate the top and bottom of the panels in reference to your tubing lines. To do this, measure the distance between the tubing, divide that number in half, and that will be the distance from the top of the tubing to the top of the panel, and from the bottom of the tubing to the bottom of the panel. Now, cut the panels using a segmented cast saw blade. Yes, you cut right through the tubing as you go. Take your time with this, and use the small end of the saw blade for the tight turns. Next, grind the panels and frame edges, and clear any debris from the holes. All exit holes should be smooth to prevent lace damage. Then, use the grinder to expose the silicone on the dial base. Remove the silicone and notice the 3 small triangles on one side of the base. Below these is an area into which you will drill what we call the pilot hole. This pilot hole allows you to access the release tab to completely remove the dial, if that becomes necessary at some point. For now, just take note of it and continue grinding the edges of the socket to the top of the dial base. Grind slowly, being careful not to grind into the dial base itself. Finish smoothing the panels, lacing holes, frame edges, and dial base by hand sanding with 1000 grit sandpaper. Remember, any sharp edges can cause damage to the laces. With a razor blade, trim the tube from the interior of the dial base and remove the ends, along with the clay. Make sure the tubing is clear of any debris. At this point, you will drill your pilot hole. The 3 triangles on the top of the dial base show you where to aim. Drill through the lamination into the area under the triangles, on an angle until you've reached a void. It'll be pretty obvious when you get there because the drill pressure stops. Next, we will attach the pads. Remember, the pad should be thick enough that the panels rest above the socket frame when the patient is wearing it. Once the thickness is determined, use your panels to trace the pads, then glue them to the panels and trim them to size. Use the grinder to shape and skive the pads into a convex shape for optimal pressure in the socket. It is often the case that the padding on the posterior panel is not thick enough to achieve a convex shape, as happened here. In that case, glue on another layer of padding and use the grinder to skive to a convex shape. In preparation for lacing the system together, determine the correct orientation of the panels. Then, use the wire lacing tool to feed the lace through the socket, starting and ending at the interior of the dial base, lacing the panels into place as you go. Pull the lace through, making sure it moves easily through the socket. Then, measure about 15 centimeters of tail on both ends and cut. Now, attach the lace to the dial. Notice that the dial has 2 small holes and 2 larger holes. Use the wire lacing tool to thread the lace into one of the small holes on the dial and out of the corresponding large hole on the other side. Tie a double overhand knot. Trim, burn the end, and pull the knot into the dial. Repeat for the other lace end. To attach the dial to the base, remove the slack from the lace by pulling the panels out until the dial meets the base. Insert the feet of the dial into the slots in the base and turn it a quarter turn clockwise to lock it into place. Cycle the system several times by pulling up on the dial to release the lace tension and pull the panels out. Re-engage the dial by pushing down and twist to tighten, ensuring that the lace is not caught anywhere in the system. If the lace is caught for some reason, you'll need to remove the dial and clear the snag. There are two ways to remove the dial. One is to use the T6 tool included in the kit. Insert this into the pilot hole to push on the release tab and twist the dial counterclockwise. The other way is to use pliers to squeeze the base of the dial, again putting pressure on the release tab and turning the dial counterclockwise to remove it. Once the snag is cleared, reinsert the dial and cycle the system again. Socket complete, mission accomplished. It's a good idea to watch this lamination video a few times before building your first socket. And remember, we're here to help. We have lots of resources on our website, and if you get stuck along the way, call our fabrication hotline to speak with one of our specialists. Congratulations! With your definitive built, you have entered the world of adjustability. In that world, you will find happier patients who fix their own fit issues instead of visiting you for every bit of maintenance. Now, simply tune and deliver the socket and figure out what you're going to do with all that extra time you will now have. Vacation, anyone?